At the beginning. Can you see me okay? Just make sure.
Yep,
And you can hear me okay.
can hear you fine.
Less background noises.
Yeah, basically no background noise.
No background noises. Fuck me. This is bullshit. All right. I suggest we give it a try. We might not finish or, um, hit the points this time, but it's okay. We're bootstrapping, so we'll get
Fair
there.
enough. Sounds good.
All right. So it is now 037. And welcome to NBA Without BS. In this podcast, we will talk with Scott James Berdahl, classmate of mine from INSEAD. Scott's going to tell you a bit more about his background, but I can share that before going to INSEAD, Scott was a gold digger. Literally digging and looking for gold, entrepreneur, part of a family business, and founded a variety of businesses himself. And his entrepreneurial spirit eventually led him to an MBA. And after that, he'll tell you in a second. Very good friend of mine, also an inspirational story. So, Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mikey.
How are
Yeah,
things over on the Beyond the Wall?
well, things are cold here. It's minus 18 this morning and very windy, but it's good.
Tell our listeners where you're at.
Yeah, I'm up in Whitehorse in the Yukon Territory. It's northwestern Canada, not the University of Connecticut.
All right, perfect. So, to our listeners, I'll share that I've been to the Yukon exactly a year ago in Thanksgiving, and it is wild. It is wild country, and I recommend every single individual listening to this podcast to visit there at least once in their lifetime, preferably in about a year from now or more, when there are some really cool stuff, adventures to do there, which Scott might tell you about in a second. So,
Sure.
Scott, we're going to start like we start with our MBAs. Your story in 2 minutes. Shoot.
All right. Yeah, well, like you say, I grew up here. I grew up prospecting, actually, fell into it. My dad's a prospector. We lived in a little cabin, no power, no running water, looking for minerals out in the bush. And so yeah, I did that and had the kind of traditional life as well. Like went to school, uh, graduated from school, and yeah, unlike I guess the theme of your show, I did go to university. Spent a couple of years studying aerospace engineering and ended up switching into geology and bumped right back into prospecting, really. Um, but yeah, actually, I think I have the opposite problem with a lot of your guests, where I have too much BS, I guess you could say. Um, yeah, I came into the MBA with 3 degrees, no, 4 degrees, Jesus. Um, After my undergrad, I did a degree in writing just because it was interesting, and I've always liked writing. Kind of less focused on the immediate practical that I did my undergrad on, and more on just what I wanted to do. And after a few years, I went back to school in Saudi Arabia, studying more geology and the more mathematical side of geophysics and that sort of thing. But then a lot of what prospecting is, what mineral exploration is business. Like you find something in the bush, uh, and you come up with a good story, and the next thing you know, you're at a conference and you're basically structuring deals. You're trying to figure out how to make it work, or you're managing field programs with big crews. And so yeah, so then it made sense to go for an MBA from there, and yeah, ended up at INSEAD and got back into prospecting. But the MBA has kind of introduced some new uh, avenues, I guess, to the path.
Very cool. So I'm gonna share because you haven't mentioned it that you did your undergrad in MIT in aerospace engineering, as you said, and after that switched to geology and technical writing. So tell us a bit about that period after school. By the way, some of our guests do have undergrads or even masters, but they still picked up quite an unusual background, like being a professional poker player, or being a cellist, or a pianist, or an opera singer, or or a gold digger.
Yeah, for sure.
So back to the same question. So after MIT, you're out, and what do you do? How does your
Yeah,
every
so
day look like?
well, after wait, sorry, this was after the writing degree, after my undergrad, and then yeah, well, that was actually I was kind of going down a path towards doing a lot of magazine writing and stuff like that. I love to travel. I took a year off when I was an undergrad, and just with no goal in mind except to just see where things would take me. I bought a plane ticket to Moscow and spent the next 8 months drifting around over like Siberia, Mongolia, and a whole bunch of places through Asia. And yeah, with the kind of idea that maybe I'd fall into that sort of a lifestyle where I'd travel and write and take pictures and so on. And yeah, when I graduated from the writing program, I was doing an internship with Canadian Geographic, and I might well have stayed on uh, in that kind of a role. But at the same time, uh, I'd helped my father out since I was a kid with prospecting stuff in Yukon. Prospecting is exploring for new mines, not just gold, but it could be copper, zinc, tungsten, uranium, whatever. Um, Trying to find the new sources for the future for these materials. And yeah, so while I was at my internship with Canadian Geographic, we had all these. I was helping and through the previous year of science writing, we had all these deals kind of fall into place. There was this gold rush, a modern day gold rush that was happening in the Yukon Territory, where I'm from, and yeah, so more and more of my time, I was just kind of doing behind the scenes things for this gold rush while I was interning, well, doing my thesis at MIT and then interning at Canadian Geographic. And so, I'd spend my days fact checking articles and doing, writing little pieces for their website and stuff. And then I'd go home at night and I'd be laying out like a grid for a helicopter to fly to lay out claim
Hmm.
posts for if we had crews of like 15 people in the bush at that point. And so I was remote managing all the IT stuff and the logistical planning for that in the evenings, and then back to work and uh, looking at like a rodeo in southern Ontario and editing photos for it and stuff like that. So that was interesting, and obviously I was kind of chomping at the bit to get back up to the Yukon at that point. So that kind of switched off the writing path and has for the last decade or more now, which is fine. I just kind of go with the flow, I guess. And yeah, and so that yeah, the next thing was like a week out of my uh, after graduating from that writing program after the internship, I was out there and just thinking like a few times, like, man, if my classmates could see what I was up to right now, just being on the side of a mountain, like 100 kilometers from the nearest road, the snow's coming down and you're just blazing a trail through this crazy alpine country. It was a gold rush. So at that point, we had some backers and we were picking up a lot of interesting looking ground so that we could have the rights to explore it later. And yeah, no, it was an interesting time, and it was full on. So hit the ground running there for a few years.
So most people, I think, don't know how the life of a prospector look like. I'm going to share the bit that I've seen, which is basically being on your own or with a very small team in the middle of nowhere, um, collecting, you know, evidence in a way that might suggest a bigger, a bigger finding of any metal, whether it's gold or silver or tungsten or uranium. A part of it is kind of intuitive or historic, where you start off with a lead from like a story or something similar, and part of it is like pure geology, where you look at a certain ridge or a certain landscape and you say, oh, something might be there. Um, and the reason I'm sharing this is just because to kind of transmit the adventurous nature that is a um, part of this business. And when I was fortunate enough to travel with Scott and see it, and it was just friggin' awesome. So the life of an adventurer, for sure. And then what happened? How did you get into a situation where you're in Saudi Arabia doing your masters and you're going for an MBA?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, so I guess I can just pick up from the gold rush there, and
Yep.
just like any gold rush, it petered off, and well, actually, it kind of switched off dramatically. So yeah, the gates closed. So, one day you couldn't stake ground fast enough, you couldn't explore fast enough, and there was no limit to kind of the amount of backing that was out there. And then the next, it just everything is dried up, and actually it's been in a sort of depressed state since. It's a very boom and bust industry, and yeah, so it was hard to turn that off after just being at that point. I was like 24 years old, I think, and running these crews. I would have a helicopter, a mechanic, a cook, like 15 guys, all at these remote places, and you're running these million-dollar programs, multi-million-dollar programs. Like, it feels like you're kind of doing something great and successful when you're at that age, and that kind of stuff's going on. So it's kind of hard to like recognize when that whole industry has hit a wall, or that whole reality is just kind of switched off. And so, I spun my tires. I was working just as hard for several years after that, and just nothing happening. And so, uh, yeah, after a while, I started to take a little bit of time off here and there and do other interesting things. And one thing that came across my desk was, yeah, straight out of this writing program, was a invitation to apply for an internship. It was 4 weeks paid in Saudi Arabia, and I just thought, when am I ever going to get to Saudi Arabia? Until a couple of weeks ago, nobody could go there unless you're going on your pilgrimage to Mecca, and not being Muslim, I just would not have a chance to do that. Um, so yeah, I figured I could, you know, live a little more puritanical for a couple of weeks and go check it out. And it turned out that they had just built this tremendous university. It's called KAUST, the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology. That opened now, I guess, 10 years ago. And but yeah, the late King Abdullah had this vision of uh, bringing back the Middle East as a center of learning globally, like it was, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, uh, when they were at the forefront of a lot of different fields of science and mathematics and so on. And so they did an admirable job, and they built this incredible place there. And of course, I guess any country in the Middle East has its challenges, and Saudi Arabia is certainly no exception. But for what they're building, it was quite incredible. Obviously, it captivated me enough that I put in an application, and as a student. So I kind of jumped from being a faculty, or not faculty, staff in their communications department, to then joining up as a student that fall. Spent a couple of years there, and yeah, it was incredible. It was pretty great to have once you're inside, you're kind of inside. I bought a car, and I would spend weekends, procrastinating from time to time on work. I would look up Saudi and Google Earth and just find these cool places. Then on weekends, I'd drive out to these places, go camping, and go check them out. And it's an incredible country. And so, that little pitch from the nascent Saudi tourism industry: if you get a chance, definitely go. Obviously, it's easier for some people than others, but
So you're in Saudi, and I'm gonna jump ahead because the next stage was to go to Singapore and do an MBA. But that's where I wanna pause. So far you grew up basically in the bush, wild country. You go to Boston, you do your bachelor's, your master's. You put in some, or more than some, few years of hard work in the field, and faith gets you to Saudi, first as an employee, then as a student. You finish your master's, and sometimes during that time you decide to do an MBA. And my question is, why?
there are a few factors. I guess one part of it, a big part of it, was what I touched on earlier, where in exploration, it's science and it's adventure, uh, to a point, and then you get to that point, and you've found a new gold discovery, and you have these hypotheses that need to be tested, but you need millions of dollars to actually test them, or you're looking at kind of launching a company through that, or selling it to a company, and so on. So yeah, I realized that only half of it is science, and the other half is business, and I guess that goes for a lot of ventures, whether it's science or arts or whatever. business is how a lot of the world runs. And so I was hoping to find that kind of understanding, get a leg up on others, and also just get to the same stride as people who do have that kind of background and kind of know what they're talking about and that sort of thing. So that was a big motivator. And it was I kind of had a year or two to kick around. The nothing was going on in the prospecting world still, so I was hoping that by the time I came out of that program in Saudi, that things would be just full jets again, but they definitely weren't. And so I looked around and found INSEAD, and it seemed like a great place. I was also interested. I probably would have gone to some American schools potentially. INSEAD was my first choice, but we don't need to get too brand specific here. I guess it's a broader MBA thing. But I also, I've always loved Northern Canada, where I come from, and I've never really planned on not living here, but I have traveled a lot, and I enjoyed living in Saudi just as a totally different place, and I wanted to keep that ball rolling. So so that made an ideal choice when I could live in Singapore and live in France as well. So there's a bit of an adventure in the MBA itself as well.
Awesome. So if I'm kind of repeating what I heard as the motivations, one of them was kind of getting a deeper or stronger grasp on kind of the business language to help you in your existing business, which is more on the, let's say, more on the line of arts and science, if you can say that. I guess geology and prospecting is to an extent that. So one was, getting a stronger business foundation, maybe learning the business jargon, learning the language, getting some tools that will allow you to get what you said, a leg up on competitors in your field, but also to kind of be able to talk the same language as maybe the bankers or the investors or the investment bankers. Excuse me one second. Yep.
Yeah.
New York
You gotta
City.
get that studio.
You get the sirens. Yep. And the second one was the adventure element. So you've traveled basically worldwide, have some nice stories to tell, and maybe this was another adventure for you.
Yeah, and I don't know. I guess there's also the definition of adventure might be broader in my mind than what some people would think. And I see that as an adventure itself. Just going into an MBA and exploring the business world and that kind of thing. Like it's definitely adventure or a venture. I don't know what the ad prefix really means, but yeah. So just kind of checking out a whole different realm of reality. That was part of the adventure. Of course, the geographical places for that particular school are pretty great too. But
awesome. So you get into the MBA, and what do you see? What strikes you? What is your impression?
Oh, that was interesting. Yeah, I saw. I guess I didn't know what to expect, and I saw exactly what I expected. But it was like, yeah, no, I suppose I was expecting some of the, there's a lot of like finance types, consultants, and so on, and that was a world that I kind of knew because a lot of my friends from MIT went into those paths, but it was still fairly new to me. But what really stood out to me was seeing the other individuals who had come, and in some cases, there's definitely some overlap, and there were some incredible people in finance and consulting and so on. But what really kind of jumped out at me were people who had done, the people who are your targets for this whole podcast and venture. People coming with interesting entrepreneurial experience, people with just really cool stories, and mostly it was their perspectives on things too. That just seeing how people turn things over in their mind in totally different ways than most of the people I'd interacted with. So that was, I guess, part from the international student body, but also part from just the backgrounds that that they'd kind of filtered out through so many people, just in terms of what the actual final student body is there. So that was great to be able to interact with people like that.
Give me an example.
Well, you, Mikey, you're a good
I'll
one.
give me another example.
No, that was it. That was it.
Okay.
No,
All right. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, no, it was well, I mean, yeah, I'll actually build on your example there. There were a lot of people who did really cool things. Shy with his dog shade company. Like, who would ever think of that kind of thing? And yet he was rolling with it, and it was awesome. And in your case, like, this is a story that we should definitely flesh out sometime in full. Your listeners deserve to know. But like, so for instance, Mikey comes out of this lecture. There's this real estate tycoon who's visiting campus in Fontainebleau in France, and he's just given this speech. This guy is like a multi-billionaire, one of the titans of the world real estate, or the global real estate world, and he has given this speech very generously to the student body at INSEAD, and he's getting into his limo to go back to Paris, to fly back to wherever. And Mikey happens to be walking by, or happens to be, um, and just says to the guy, like, "Oh, I happen to be sorry to bother you, but I happen to be going to Paris too, and I'm late because I wanted to catch your talk. Would you mind if I hop in with you?" And we're not, yeah, people at the people who had invited him are just kind of with their jaws on the floor, and Mikey hops into the limo and gets a free 40-minute interview with this guy.
Yeah,
And
more like an hour and a half. There was a lot of traffic.
yeah, and then you just get out. Oh yeah, this is where I was going, and then you turn the corner, get in the subway, straight back to school. And that was pretty incredible. So yeah, that kind of mentality, that kind of thinking,
Yeah.
whether it's that or yeah, from other students, it was that was one of the big takeaways actually.
Thank you for bringing that up. That was a very good memory. Um,
For sure.
was a very teaching one. I wonder whether to mention his name or not because it was really a good lecture. But I'm gonna put some uh, I'm gonna put a cloud of vagueness around this podcast and not mention his name and say, if you want to know his name, this real estate tycoon's name, and what went on in the conversation, ping me, message me.
Good.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna, I might tell you a few details. Nothing juicy, but definitely details.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that was a great experience. And to kind of pay that back, I would say that um, well, I would say two things. Number one, the name of this podcast and the book that I'm writing right now is actually Scott's idea, right? MBA without BS. Uh, so kudos to him and a shout out to him, Scott, who you're listening to. And the second is that I've really, really learned what is a sense of adventure from Scott. I mean, this guy. Hopefully, we'll do a follow-up podcast with some of the stories. But just sat with him on the first week, and I started listening to stories, and I'm like, what? Wait, you actually did that? Wait, this is. I think I read it in like a book. So I'm gonna give one example. Scott was when we had our break in the MBA between the third and fourth mini semesters. Scott took a delegation of two other classmates and went to climb Mount Kenya and then snowboarded. I think he was like the seventh or eighth person ever to do that, and he just saw it 5 years earlier when he was flying to Ethiopia. I think just saw it out of the window, saw there was some snow. He was like, "Oh, this is cool, snow in Africa. Maybe I should snowboard that," and he ended up doing that. So yeah, absolutely. So Scott, I want to one point that I try and emphasize to our newcomers, right, to our candidates, is within the admission equation, there are three and a bit parts, right? So the first part is creating value for your classmates and your cohort, your school. The second part is telling a good story. The third part is meeting the requirements, obviously, and a bit part is having some nice tips and tricks. I want to ask you on the second part because I think you're one of the best storytellers I've met. So, what are your tips for the guys and girls listening to us on telling a good story?
Man, I have no idea how to follow that up. I don't know. I would beg to disagree, but I guess in telling a story, I think just it kind of comes back to writing, where you want to be in the reader's shoes when you're writing something. Like you want to have some kind of empathy or awareness of not just what you want to communicate, but when they hear it, how they're processing it. I find also, in the case of, it doesn't go for for day-to-day conversation unless you tell a story a whole bunch of times, in which case you want to monitor who you're telling it to, so you don't repeat it a whole bunch of times. But yeah, in the case of something like admissions, then you actually have the opportunity, if you get started on it soon enough, that you can kind of tell your story and put it away for a bit. And this is just a good part of the writing process anyway. When you don't have a tight deadline, you write out what you're writing out and put it away. And then when you read it again, you're almost reading it as though you are your target audience, and you get to see that again and read it as though you're a stranger. And you can see so many just obvious oversights in your initial communication of the idea, and where you're making some assumption in the reader's head that is not there, and that sort of thing. So um, yeah, I think that's part of it, is just and that's just one thing with admissions, where you get an extra bonus chance to look back at things. But in terms of good storytelling, just staying in the reader's mind, in a sense, or the listener's mind.
So you're saying staying in the reader's or the listener's mind, and the practical way of doing that you just suggested is write it out once, put it aside, go back to it, kind of reread it, and what? And draw the storyline and redraw the storyline, focus it.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, don't do what I just did. I think that whole spiel I just gave was horrible storytelling. But yeah, when you come back in, you want to, uh, yeah, you're just reading it from a different perspective, and you basically take that perspective and you realize that that is what the listener sees, and then you tweak it accordingly. Whether it is, laying out your points in the order that you want to see them, but that's probably something you were doing initially. But you might see ways to restructure it. Yeah, and this is all specific to storytelling on the page. um, yeah, but I think you don't really know what you're going to see when you read it again. That's why you read it again. So whether it's just reframing or just making some grammatical tweaks or whatever, uh, you might see some big things that you miss, and all that ties back to just being empathetic, being like thinking about not what you want to tell necessarily, but what the impact is in the reader's or the listener's mind.
So if you had to rewrite the last 3 minutes as a story in 15 seconds or under, rewrite it for me.
I would have just passed the question. Next question.
All right, but give it a try. Rewrite
Okay.
the last 3 minutes.
Okay.
How to for telling a good story.
How to tell a good story. Create expectation. That I didn't even mention, but and yeah, just think about what is interesting and say that.
Awesome. All right, so you're done with INSEAD. You're going out, done your MBA, and give the listeners maybe an overview of what you're doing right now. So I'm just going to open parenthesis and say that many times we interview people like 10 years after their MBA or 8 years after their MBA. But in this specific case, I think Scott's story is just an exceptional story, and it's a great story. And Scott and I are both just a few years after our MBA, so he's still work in process. And in a few years, I'm sure you're going to hear about big successes of Scott and big achievements, and you're gonna say, "Oh, I listened to this guy on MBA without BS." But for the time being, Scott, tell us what's going on.
Well, yeah, I recently moved back to the Yukon after the MBA. I took a job in Vancouver. That's when obviously you came out into the field with me, that was pretty cool. And but that job wasn't quite. I mean, there was a lot that was exciting about it. I learned a lot there, but I was kind of looking for something a little more entrepreneurial. It was kind of ironic to go and learn about the business side only to take a job, I thought. And so yeah, I moved back up to the Yukon, just knowing that's where I wanted to be. I still have interest in a lot of mineral projects here. I still have the business of my father that we are still active in. But yeah, one thing that, and this is kind of a direct result of doing the MBA, was that I came back, not only with that, the business skills, or I would almost call it more perspective, um, relevant to my field, but I also kind of started looking over the fence into other things that are going on. And I mean, it's still very nascent, but yeah, I'm just looking into a tourism venture up here that I'm pretty excited about. So, it's almost the opposite of mineral exploration, but like you say, I do like telling stories. And even in university, I think I overheard someone calling me the guy who always talks about the Yukon. And so I've found kind of a way to share my love for this place and to tell the stories of this place to a lot of people. And yeah, so looking at branching out from prospecting into tourism and into other ventures that come along with that.
So I'm gonna take this opportunity and shout out to everyone who's listening to us. You know, and I'm gonna make Scott a volunteer here. So if you are looking for an adventure, go north. Go as far north as you can, and ping Scott or ping me, and I'm gonna point you to Scott because he is truly one of a kind. He is an ambassador of the Yukon, of the Northern Territories, of everything beyond the wall. And if you want your if you want your personal Jon Snow to kind of give you the ins and outs of what's going on and how you can survive White Walkers, then Scott is the man for that. Um, and I have to say that after being there, I just first of all, after being there, I feel connected for life to the Northern Territories, to the Yukon, and I think a big part of that is because of Scott and his friends and family whom I met. It's also just such an incredible place, and I think the vision to make this place accessible and exciting for people from all over the world to come over to see it, to experience it. It truly is nature in its rawest form. Like, sure, you can find a McDonald's, like if you really look hard, but if you step 20 meters outside that McDonald's, you can find, I don't know, a bear or or a
Yeah.
moose or just a bunch of really, really cool people uh, living in a really, really low density area.
Yeah, it's a great place. We're the size of Spain geographically, and we have 30,000 people. So it's like you take Fontainebleau, where we finished off the NBA there, plop it down in Spain, take everyone else out, and that's the Yukon.
Fantastic. Um, Scott, I'm going to ask you two more questions before we start coming into a conclusion. So the first question is, what did you get out of the MBA?
Um,
Main things, of course.
yeah. Well, a lot of people talk about skills coming from the MBA, especially going into it on applications, talking about skills they want to pick up, and you pick up skills. But I would say the bigger thing is more perspective. You know, and really just in any field, any part of business, you kind of get an idea of what's there and kind of how it applies and that sort of thing. And so, like, the skills themselves, I think, are pretty job specific. And you're not necessarily going to come out uh, as some kind of superhuman who can do everything, but you know which skills you need to build when you see a path. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to launch a company. So here's what I need to do, and you know exactly kind of where to brush up on things. And so there are things that I learned and forgot in the MBA that I'm relearning now. But I know the groundwork. I know what to learn, and So that's super helpful. Another thing is, and this is pretty common, the network. But I don't necessarily. I mean, it's useful in the way that people think about it, but I mean it more in the sense that what I was talking about before, where you amongst your classmates, amongst the people that you meet there, you just see a lot of people doing a lot of cool things, and there's kind of a mentorship where you learn a little bit from each of your peers, and you can kind of channel that into the toolkit that you want to have, or the personality, or like whatever the business sense that you want to build for yourself. Um, and and one other thing I took from it, which is, warranted or not, is just, and this is sadly or happily, I don't know, part of the value of an MBA is the recognition that comes with it. I feel that nobody should take me any differently now than before I started, but people do. And so, if I go to a bank and want a whole bunch of money for a crazy idea I have, just these letters after my name actually make that a lot easier. So it's a more practical, uh, takeaway from the MBA, but it's certainly a real impact.
Absolutely. So perspective, a network of mentors, and the recognition that comes with being an MBA, especially
Yeah,
when dealing with outsiders, let's say, or people who have interests in that sort of recognition.
for sure. Yeah. Yeah. Great listening. Those were my exact 3 points that I have written down here. So
All right, guys, we are going to wrap up. I am encouraging you to contact Scott, even though he didn't ask me to do this, but I'm still asking you to contact Scott, bother him, email him, ping him, with anything and everything that's related to the Yukon or Northern Territories or geology or any adventure almost on every continent in this planet. Just a great guy. Hopefully, he will start a podcast one day, or a video blog where he shares his adventures, because there are so many. And I've really enjoyed this. This Scott, as I mentioned before, he's a really good friend of mine. I think his story is an inspiration. The way he lives his life is an inspiration for me to just go out, put yourself out there, get into crazy adventures and see what happens. Not try to control life, but more just live it and live it on the edge, live it on the extreme. Um,
yeah, if
Scott,
all else fails, you can live in a cabin in the woods. So.
yeah, and I'm going to mention, maybe as a last thing, what your father said to us when we were in the Yukon around the bonfire with your friends, your family. I think it was your birthday. So he kind of sat next to us, Ron, and put his hand on our shoulders and said, "Boys, you worked so hard to build a safety net. Don't use it as a hammock." And I've taken that phrase or that saying with me since, and I think Scott's story is just, it's a living example of that. You build a safety net, you go to school, you build your education, your financials, and go out, live, travel, do crazy things, go out, seek adventures, meet people, talk to people, see what's going on. The world is big and it's full of phenomenal things. Um, Start a podcast, you know. Tag me there. I'd be happy to talk to you. All right, that's all for today, folks. So thank you very much for listening. This is MBA Without BS. We share the stories of MBAs with non-traditional backgrounds, and we're pushing and encouraging all of you to go out and pursue higher education, get adventurous, travel, see the world, connect with people. If we can be of help, we don't need your money. We just want to know that you're all in. Just ping us. Social networks, our website, mbawobs.com. We're here for you. So that's it for today, Scott. Thank you very much for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Mikey. Appreciate it. That was fun.
All right. Very good. Bye-bye.